Today, I'm making clone armor. For this build, I used EVA foam, craft foam, coffee foam, putty, super glue, hot glue, cutting tools, sanding tools, safety gear, scissors, razor pens, and a box cutter. I'm gonna start with the knees on this build because they were surprisingly the most complicated part of the build, and honestly, everything after this was a breeze, so I figure get it out of the way first, you know? The main difficulty here is that this is based on the Clone Wars TV show, the one that was computer animated, because that's where we get the most detailed shots of the armor and all of its variations. But being a cartoon, armor plates that are supposed to be solid warp and bend in reality-defying ways as the characters move. So through trial and error, I landed on a shape that would look most accurate when it's translated to real life as a solid piece. Well, accurate to me anyway. From a certain point of view. Use the force. Now, figuring things out through trial and error is a good way to waste foam, so I like to figure these out on scrap cardboard first before transferring them to clean cardstock and scanning them in to make them available to you guys. And that's just because there's usually some refinement in this process, and I like to take care of all that refinement work in a more disposable material. Also, I don't want you to waste your printer ink on cardboard. It seems a little unnecessary. I traced that onto white EVA foam and cut it out with the razor pen. I'm using white EVA foam so that I don't have to paint. Most of the time commitment involved in these projects is waiting for layers of paint to dry. So when I can, I like to build out a material that matches the final color. It also helps that the clone troopers specifically don't have shiny armor. You know, I always wondered about that. Isn't white the worst possible camouflage in space? Or everywhere, except for that one snow planet. I cut the curved pieces at an angle so that the knee protector would flare out at the sides and therefore adhere to the shape of the knee rather than sit on top of it. Then I made the centerpiece, which only has a slight curve to it and is not quite rectangular, because that would make my life too easy. And then I lightly heat formed it with the heat gun. When I was happy with the shapes, I super glued them together. Because foam is an insulator, it will temporarily get very hot, so if you do this, be very careful, because you can get like tiny but very painful burns. Once they were both built, I tested them out on my actual knee and trimmed the excess off the flanges that wrap behind it. Now for the shin guards. I also figured those out on cardboard first. Every piece is figured out on cardboard first. See, each armor segment is kind of its own prop build in and of itself, which is why this video took so long. So each piece has to be patterned out from scratch. Occasionally you catch a break because there's a lot of recurring shapes in Star Wars. I can refer back to some of my earlier builds, but they have a habit of changing them just enough that I have to start from scratch. I weighted the floor mats down with machinist blocks so the foam doesn't slide around while I'm working. Then I cut them out. I'm also being careful to make sure that my blade is angled perfectly straight up and down. This will prevent any ridges or depressions from forming in the foam after I join the two sides. The reason the shins are so complicated is that in the show they're incredibly thin. They're so thin that if I built them exactly how they appear in the show, they'd be too narrow for me to get my foot through. So as a compromise, I'm making them with a bite cut out of the back that I'll later fill with fabric. Okay, now this is one side of one shin guard. To get the other side, I flipped the original template and traced it again. When they were both cut out, I cut a little triangle to go between them in the notch at the top, just below the knee. Top of the shin guard below the knee. I guess that's the main way the clone trooper leg armor differs from stormtrooper armor. There are notches where the knee plates connect. I was hoping to just swap out the leg armor from the stormtrooper build and save time, but nope. George gotta make my life difficult. As the knife blade wears out, I'll sometimes get tears in the edge of each piece. This won't make for a very good gluing surface, so I sanded away those problem areas on my belt sander. If you do this a lot, if you build out of foam a lot, I'd seriously invest in a belt sander. I use it all the time, and it's not that expensive as far as tools go. It does kick up a lot of dust though. In an attempt to control the dust, I built this chute that empties directly into the trash can, hence the garbage monster in the background. Go back underwater. You're gonna get dust in your eye. You only got one. Now that that's out of the way, I can heat form, just like I did with all the previous armor pieces. I go longer on the inside because if I accidentally scorch it, no one's gonna see it. I always want to emphasize how hot the heat gun gets. So just to hammer that home, if you look closely at my pointer finger, there's a burn on my pointer finger in this shot. That's how hot it gets. It's not a hair dryer. You're gonna melt your freaking face off. Once it was heated up, I shaped it on a hard, rounded surface. After a few minutes of this, I stuck it in a tube to cool. When it had cooled, I cut a groove on the inside and folded it over on itself, gluing it together, in order to create that raised edge on the outside. When I had finished shaping both sides, I glued them together. I connected the seam in the front, but not fully in the back. I did this just a few inches at a time because super glue sets too rapidly to do a full seam all at once and ensure that it comes together evenly. I mean, it could, but why would you risk it, you know? To cover the opening in the back, I cut up a pair of long baseball socks and glued them to the interior. Then I connected the knee plate to the shin guard using a sleeve that I cut from an old shirt. I'm okay with cutting this one up. This company has some pretty shady business practices. Now for the thigh armor. This piece was too big to fit through a printer, so on the template I broke it up into smaller pieces. This is how they fit together. That's the only part of the template that I've gotten questions, so I figured I'd just get a clean shot of it, you know? Alright, let's get to it. As I'm moving up the body, I'm switching to 4mm foam because there's gonna be a lot of layered detail towards the middle, and that's gonna look super weird if I'm using the 3/8" floor mat foam. You can get this stuff at craft stores, by the way. Most craft stores have caught on to the whole cosplay thing, so they carry a wide variety of craft foam. But you still gotta go to the hardware stores for the foam floor mats, which is nuts. You'd think somebody would have told them. The thinner stuff is admittedly easier to heat form, but that also makes it easier to burn, so watch out. Oh, I made the other leg by reversing the template, by the way. I heat formed and shaped those pieces, then I closed up the seams with super glue. Then I cut a new seam in front. I know that seems counterintuitive, but I need to add an edge in the front there. And this foam is just a little bit too thin to use the same back cutout technique that I did on the back of the shin guard. I cut a triangle to mesh with the knee plate and glued that into the thigh. I also added a strip of foam above it to create the crease. When both were complete, I moved up the armor. The seat and cod piece are basically the same as the classic Stormtrooper, but just a little more angular. So I added side panels in the front and totally ignored the back because it's actually going to be covered up by the rest of the costume. So if no one's going to see it, why am I wasting time on it? I made the cod piece out of 2 halves and then heat formed them to glue them together. I'll often reheat armor plates after the sections are glued together and the glue is dry, just to even them out a little bit and make them more symmetrical. Then I attach them to the armor. Next, for the belt, I just picked up a white belt. Easy enough. Although, I'm gonna have to make mounting plates to attach all the utility boxes to, because this belt is partially stretchy, so it's a very poor gluing surface. Not to mention it's too thin. I'm using 2mm foam for the front-facing portion, which is a little bit wider than the rest of it, and mounting the details to that. I created a track by gluing 2 strips of puzzle piece foam, with the puzzles cut off, on the outer edges. I used a combination of 2mm, 4mm, and 3/8" thick EVA foam for the various boxes. I started with the 2 smallest ones in the front. In the cartoon, these are condensed into a buckle. Then I made the 2 main pouches, which are about the same from live action to the animation. This is all the pieces before assembly, and this is after, in case you couldn't tell. I added a small piece in the back just to help hold it to the belt in addition to the glue. Now, when it comes to the belt boxes, you've got some options. The number and configuration of the pouches changes depending on what movie, game, or TV series you're watching, or episode of the show you're watching. I've included them all in the template, but another unusual limiting factor that I discovered while making the belt pouches is that the skinnier you are, the less real estate you have to work with, and therefore the fewer pouches you can include. Hence why the animated ones don't have all of them. And being a starving artist, I'm gonna have to forego the back pouches. Support me on Patreon so that my costumes can be accurate. One day, my Porkins cosplay will fit. Don't be too generous though, or I'll end up cosplaying Jabba, the Shakespeare the Hutt. And honestly, you can get away with no pouches. People will get that you're a clone trooper, just an off-duty clone trooper. I do at least the main 2 and the thermal detonator on the back, just because pockets. You won't have to carry things. I also decided to build 2 holsters, which luckily will still be able to fit because they actually hang below the utility boxes. I built them with spacers inserted on the interior so that they'd hold their contents snugly, closed it up, and added some minimalist detail on the outside. And now for the blasters. Shh! Don't tell the algorithm. I, for one, am perfectly willing to create content that abides by the ad revenue policies outlined by our robot overlords. I swear this platform's becoming a Soviet dystopia. Oh no, she heard me! Support me on Patreon so that I can build blasters again. Anyway, I've actually got a whole tutorial for this exact blaster. It got grandfathered in because I made it back in 2015. It's on this channel. I'll link it somewhere. The only thing I did differently this time was add some rounded offcuts from the Pitroid build to the plunger on the back there. I painted those and moved on. Now for the cylinder on the back of the belt. So it's a gray cylinder with a white wrap. I cut some really clean circles and exterior panel pieces, and the inside is garbage, just straight up garbage. All I'm trying to do is use up my scrap foam. I covered that garbage with white paneling. When the glue dried, I added the detail greeblies. Most of these details are accurate, the outward facing ones, but the ones on the sides are extra, and the ones on the back are really only there for stability. Those will help it lock on to its mounting plate. Because I don't trust a tension fit alone, I found a box of old nails and pressed them into the cylinder. Then I made a custom mounting plate that both fits into the notch that the greeblies make on the exterior of the thermal detonator and has embedded magnets to securely hold it in place. I slid it onto the belt, attached the holsters, and that's it. Moving on up the abdomen of the clone troopers, I found that it was much narrower than the classic stormtroopers, probably to make them more visually appealing and sympathetic to an audience, because for most of the Clone Wars show, you're rooting for the clone troopers, so they just have to have a cooler costume than the classic ones, which had kind of a pudgy midsection. It does make a little bit more sense though, because I always looked at the trooper costumes like they were a spacesuit. There are 2 astronaut troopers in the original Star Wars. You can only see it if you watch that movie in a theater, because they're teeny tiny on the outside of the Death Star when they're tractoring in the Falcon. Is it Falcon or Falcon? Because I've only ever heard Harrison Ford say Falcon. So for the base layer, I'm just gonna use a blank white t-shirt and cut the sleeves off of that as well, just because I seriously want to cut down on as much layers of fabric as possible. Then the main panels on top of that were made from 2mm craft foam, 1 central shape in the middle, then 2 side panels and a back panel. I glued them onto the shirt with hot glue. Then I added black EVA foam dots in between the front panels, which was actually harder because they're so small, they're really difficult to work with. Now for the pecs. I used one of my old armor templates for that just because it happen to match. Generally, I make my templates in halves so that they can be folded over and each side will come out symmetrical. I cut that out, and because those were very long cuts, my blade dulled out a bit at the end and tore up the foam on a few of the seams. Now that's not really a huge issue because that's going to be out of sight when you're wearing it, but it's one of those nitpicky things, and the belt sander is right there, so I smoothed out that edge on the sander. Once I was finished sanding, I heat formed that piece as well. This is going to take longer because the piece is so much larger, but it's no big deal. We're talking about minutes here. It's no big deal. For the cool down process, I put it in a concrete form tube left over from the Detective Miller pet nuke build. It cooled pretty quick, but it's still kind of two-dimensional. The chest piece is basically just a platform that the pecs sit on top of, so now that it's fully heat formed, I'm gonna set it aside and do the pecs separately. I cut those out of scrap foam because I'm running out of full sheets and I got 1 left to get the backplate. Can't afford to mess it up. Then I heat formed them, placed them in a bowl until they remained rounded. Then I connected them using a strip of 4mm foam in between them. This will create just enough separation and depth that I won't have to draw the detail on. Then I glued them on top of the chest plate and added all the geometric shapes underneath so that they would sit right. And when they were in, I puttied those seams. Now for the back plate. I made that essentially the same way as the front base plate, literally all the same steps. It's a different physical shape, but it's very similar. Although I used weights this time to get the heat form to hold its shape, just because it's supposed to be a little bit flatter than the front piece. While it cooled, I made the box that rests on top of it. I started with the walls. It's less symmetrical than the original. The side walls are elongated at the bottom, creating this cavity underneath. The edges are angled so that the whole thing will be, well, angled inward. I cut the long sides at a slightly slanted angle so that it would sit correctly on the now curved backplate. Then I glued them together. Next, I cut a panel to close it up. The details on this are a lot more complicated than the original 0 and 11, but not impossible. Aesthetically, I actually like the original Stormtrooper backplate better, but this one offers more opportunities for ventilation, which can be crucial at conventions. These costumes get hot. They're great in winter though. I'd wear this outside before a down jacket. I made this stencil and traced it out of foam. For reference, those holes are about the same size as a toonie, if that helps. Don't ask me to explain Canadian money. I can't even wrap my head around it. Who doesn't use pennies anymore? What am I supposed to do with these? I cut all those out with a razor pen and a hole punch. Because the razor pen doesn't like curves, I sanded it a bit with my rotary tool. When I was satisfied with the quality, I glued it into the back box. Then I glued scrap foam over the holes to hide the interior, which is in all likelihood gonna hold an ice pack. To simulate vents, I carved them into the last piece before gluing it in. Then I flipped it over and added more detail to the little rectangle there. Just some pieces of 4mm foam and triangle bevels, simulating more vents. All the vents. Everything must be vents. Forever and ever, vents. Glued it in there, and then glued the whole thing to the backplate. Lastly, I covered the seams with putty. Lastly for this part. Next, I made the shoulder straps. These are more cosmetic than functional. I'll eventually need to put real straps underneath them. I made them out of 4mm craft foam, which I cut into strips and super glued together. Then I super glued them into the armor, connecting the front and back pieces. I glued actual buckles to the sides of the armor segments. Whenever I use hot glue, I like to weight down the pieces afterwards with machinist blocks to hold them in place and to draw out the heat, thus allowing the glue to dry faster. Well, cool faster. After that, I got to work on the arms. I started with the shoulder pauldrons. I cut those out of 3/8 inch thick EVA foam. That's the thickest foam that I'm using on this project, and I'm using it up here just to bulk out the shoulders a bit, because the chest is enormous. I put them through the same heat forming process as all the other pieces, although they're small enough that I had to skewer the pieces in order to keep my fingers away from the heat blast. I can't directly hold this piece. When you do have to skewer a piece, try to do it so that the defect is going to be hidden on the interior of the final project, because the heat forming process will make any surface damage way more visible. I formed those, glued the dart closed, and trimmed the excess. Then I made the upper arm guard. It's just a cylinder with a notch cut out the back. They're actually a little easier because they're not curved spherically, they're just tubes. Although, truth be told, I put some 4mm black foam back in there just to help hold it together. Otherwise, it's going to try and pull itself apart. I repeated those steps for the other shoulder. Next, for the gauntlet, I used a gauntlet template left over from some armor build, I don't know. I heat formed that and placed it inside the upper arm to cool. Then I puttied the seams. I repeated those steps to make the other arm. And these are the same as the gauntlets from the Kenobi armor build, although I did refine them a bit by adding internal supports to the elbow pads to help them keep their very specific and unique shape. They're meant to be very similar to the knee pads in that they're supposed to interlock with the gauntlet and upper arm pieces, just like the shin and the thigh sort of interlock. However, that's a lot of moving parts and it makes the costume somewhat cumbersome, so I decided to lock them to the gauntlets. Take it from a guy who dragged a nuke through downtown Atlanta. Anywhere you can make these things less awkward, go for it. You want to do that. So I built them into the gauntlets and then just drew on that seam with a Sharpie. I also added the comm device control pad to just cut up scrap foam, which I then glued to the gauntlet. Just the one though. Now for the gloves. So gloves that work with touch screens are expensive and they don't all work that great. This is kind of my favorite / only pair, and I have multiple suits of armor at this point. So rather than gluing the armor plate directly onto the glove, I'm gonna sew some Velcro on there so that I can use the same pair of gloves and just swap out the armor plates. Now about the helmet, there are so many variations of the helmet. I've done dozens at this point. But if you're watching this video, I assume you're looking for either the Attack of the Clones helmet or the Phase 2 helmet. As it happens, I have a full build for both of those helmets, so if this time lapse is going by too quickly, then you can just check those out. Links below and at the end of the video. Probably in comments too, just saying. Now for some of the accessories, there's this complicated collar piece that allows additional armor and accessories to be attached, so let's get to work on that. I'm actually going to start with the ammunition pouches. These are a point of contention in the Star Wars cosplay community. In live action, they're MP40 ammunition pouches because a lot of Star Wars props were made from captured and/or decommissioned military hardware left over from World War II, because that's just what they had in abundance at the time. In the cartoon, Rex has these blasters that are roughly the size of a Glock or Colt 1911, so the animators kept the MP40 configuration but shrunk them down to fit on one pack. In the Ahsoka show, they went with the big ammunition pouches and little blasters. Although, credit where credit is due, they did scale up the blasters a little bit. Just saying. And I don't think it's crazy to assume that in this particular instance, he's got carbine-sized ammunition pouches. You gonna tell me he only uses one weapon ever? But this ended up causing a ruckus amongst the CT builders community, and to this, I'll just quote the immortal words of William Shatner: "Get a life. I just like the stuff I like. I don't care about the minutia or the origins of every single switch and doodad. I see it and then I make it. I don't care but I do not care. I hate that I know all this. I don't need to know all this. My main concern while building this was making the ammunition pouches big enough to hold energy bars, because I don't want to pay for overpriced convention food. That's my main concern. Except that one sushi place above the Peachtree Station, downtown Atlanta, but I digest. So it occurred to me that I actually have snaps and leather, so I could have made these properly, but I was on the road while making this, so magnets. After I built it, I heat formed it so that it would look just a little bit more like leather, and then added magnets. Then I made a rather large collar out of 4mm foam. This is just to frame all the accessories. I made the extra shoulder padding out of blue foam, because again, hate to paint. Traced it, cut it out, scored it, heat formed it until the lines opened up. Then I added black trim, and then I attached those parts to the collar with various glues. Now this will stay there around my neck, but it's gonna flop around. So I added a buckle just to hold it in place. And of course attached a connector to the torso armor. Then I used the remnants of the Wailing Utani t-shirt to make the kilt. Seriously, it's a thing. Enoch has one. Also have an Enoch build. That's another armor variant. It's a good idea to wear black underneath just because it'll show at the joints. And I picked up some costume boots for the feet. And then I suited up, and that's how to make clone trooper armor. Thanks for watching, everybody. Hope you enjoyed this video. Once again, I'd like to thank my patrons. These videos just wouldn't be possible without the support of my patrons. So if you enjoy these builds, want to see more of them, and want your build request to carry a bit more weight, then think about heading on over to the Patreon page, where you can enjoy ad-free early uploads. Anything you can pledge goes towards improving the video quality and shop equipment, as well as allowing me to put together bigger and more exciting projects for you on the channel. Alright, hope you enjoyed this. Don't forget to like and subscribe, hit the bell icon to be notified of the future uploads, because it's kind of at a totally random schedule. And let me know what other props you'd like to see me make in comments down below. Thanks again, happy crafting, see you later!